Picture this. I caught our power-hungry HOA president red-handed having my boat towed at 5 a.m., but her smug smile vanished when she realized I had proof the land was mine and her whole property line scam was about to unravel. What would you do if you discovered your HOA president was secretly redrawing property lines to steal your land? Welcome to my channel. Please subscribe if you want more Karen and HOA stories. The bright orange paper fluttering on my boat stopped me dead in my tracks. I'd just gotten home from a long day at work, looking forward to planning this weekend's fishing trip with my daughter. When I saw it, my hands shook as I ripped the notice off. My beloved 24-foot fishing boat that had been in our family for 3 generations. The paper was warm from sitting in the sun all day, and the words made my blood boil. Violation notice unauthorized. Vehicle storage, remove within 48 hours or face immediate towing and fines. At the bottom was a signature I'd come to dread. Margaret Winters, HOA president. I looked at my boat, sitting proudly in the exact same spot where it had been for the past 5 years. Well within the boundaries of my property. My grandfather's compass still hung from the steering wheel, catching the evening light. We'd never had any problems before. Margaret moved in 6 months ago, and somehow got herself elected as HOA president. Just then, I heard the distinct click-clack of expensive heels on pavement. Margaret was doing her daily inspection walk, clipboard in hand, her perfect blonde bob swaying as she marked down every blade of grass that dared to grow a millimeter too high. She spotted me holding the notice and headed straight for my driveway. "Oh good, you found my notice," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That boat simply has to go. It's lowering property values, and the HOA bylaws clearly state no recreational vehicles can be stored in plain sight." She tapped her perfectly manicured nail on her clipboard. I took a deep breath, remembering the property survey I'd done when I first moved in. "Margaret, this boat is parked on my private property. The land extends 15 feet beyond where you think it ends. I have all the documentation to prove it." Her smile flickered for just a second. "Well, I have updated plans that show otherwise. The HOA recently had all property lines reassessed. This area," she gestured vaguely at where my boat sat, "is actually common ground now." Something felt very wrong about that statement. I'd never received any notice about property reassessment, and I served on the architectural committee until Margaret dissolved it last month. As if reading my thoughts, my neighbor Linda Chen called out from her porch across the street. "That's funny, Margaret. I worked at the county clerk's office for 30 years, and I don't remember seeing any recent surveys filed for our neighborhood." Margaret's face turned pink. "The paperwork is being processed. Regardless, that boat needs to be moved by Friday, or I'll have it towed." She spun around and click-clacked away, but not before I saw her shoot a worried glance at Linda. Later that evening, while digging through my filing cabinet for my property documents, I got a text from Derek next door. "Hey, check your security cameras from last Tuesday. Margaret was measuring your property line at 2 a.m. with some guy I've never seen before." I pulled up the footage, and sure enough, there was Margaret in the dark, whispering and pointing while a man in a suit took measurements. But what really caught my eye was what happened after they thought they were out of camera range. Margaret handed the man an envelope that looked suspiciously thick. My daughter came into my office, seeing me hunched over the computer. "Dad, are we still going fishing this weekend?" The worry in her voice made me even more determined to fight this. I picked up my phone to call Linda. If Margaret wanted to play games with property lines, she was about to learn she'd picked the wrong family to mess with. But as I dialed, I noticed something odd in the camera footage that made me pause. Margaret and her mystery man weren't just measuring my property line. They were measuring everyone's. What exactly was our new HOA president up to? The emergency HOA meeting was set for 7 p.m. in the community center, but I arrived early with a folder full of evidence. I wasn't going to let Margaret Winters bully me into moving my boat without a fight. As other neighbors filed in, I noticed Margaret huddled in the corner with her loyal followers, shooting smug looks my way. I spent my whole lunch break at the county records office that day, digging through property documents. The nice clerk there, Mrs. Rodriguez, even stayed late to help me find the original neighborhood plans from when our houses were first built. She seemed worried when I told her about Margaret's new property line claims. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the front of the room calmly. Margaret sat there in her designer blazer, tapping her expensive pen against her notepad, like she couldn't wait to write up more violations. I opened my folder and started laying out the official property maps on the table. "According to these county records," I said, pointing to the clearly marked boundaries, "my boat is parked completely within my property line." The room got so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. That's when Margaret jumped up, her face turning redder than the fancy sports car she always parked in the visitor spots. She yanked out her own set of papers from her designer bag. "These new plans clearly show that area is common ground," she snapped, waving around what looked like freshly printed documents. But something wasn't right. The papers she held up had different measurements than what I'd found in the county records. I asked to see her documents closer, but she clutched them to her chest like they were made of gold. "These are official HOA documents," she said, her voice getting higher. "They're confidential." My neighbor Derek, who usually stayed quiet at these meetings, suddenly spoke up. "I think Margaret's right," he said, not meeting my eyes. "The boundaries were redrawn last year." But when I looked at him, he was sweating, and his hands were shaking. Something was definitely fishy. I pulled out my phone and showed everyone the photos I'd taken of the original property stakes, still in the ground from when the houses were built. The metal markers clearly matched my maps, not Margaret's new ones. Other neighbors started whispering and pointing at their own copies of Margaret's plans. Linda Chen, who used to work as a property lawyer before retiring, raised her hand. "These measurements don't add up," she said, adjusting her glasses as she looked at Margaret's documents. "According to these numbers, half the properties would be overlapping each other." Margaret's face went from red to white faster than a traffic light. She started gathering her papers, dropping some in a rush. I noticed something odd about the ones that fell. They had different dates on them, but the ink looked exactly the same, like they'd all been printed at once. Just then, Mrs. Rodriguez from the county office walked in. She'd come to the meeting after her shift because she was worried about what she'd found, or rather, what she hadn't found. There were no records of any official property, line changes in our neighborhood, for the past 20 years. Margaret stormed out of the meeting, but not before threatening to have my boat towed anyway. "We'll see who has the right documents," she snarled. As she left, I noticed Derek following her, looking nervous and guilty. I stayed late, talking with Linda Chen about the strange documents. She pointed out something I hadn't noticed. The notary stamp on Margaret's papers was from someone whose license had expired 3 years ago. When we looked closer at the other papers Margaret had dropped, we found more problems. The signatures didn't match, the dates were wrong, and some of the street names were spelled differently on different pages. As I drove home that night, I spotted Derek and Margaret having what looked like a heated argument in her driveway. He was waving his arms around, pointing at some papers, while she jabbed her finger at his chest. I slowed down just enough to snap a quick photo with my dash cam. Back home, I started laying out all the evidence on my kitchen table. The original maps, the photos of the property stakes, the pictures of Margaret's suspicious documents, and that last shot of her arguing with Derek. I had a feeling this was bigger than just my boat, but I needed proof. Lucky for me, I still had a friend working at the title company who owed me a favor. I fell asleep at my kitchen table around midnight, surrounded by papers and post-it notes. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Meet me tomorrow morning at the coffee shop. I know what Margaret's really up to." When I looked out my window, I saw Derek's kitchen light on, and his shadow pacing back and forth. The morning started with a strange envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a handwritten letter from Derek, my neighbor of 5 years, and my hand started shaking as I read it. "I need to tell you something that's been eating me up inside," the letter began. "Margaret has dirt on all of us, but what she's doing to you isn't right." I sat down on my front steps, reading how Derek had been helping Margaret create fake property documents. She'd caught him building his pool house without permits last summer, and instead of reporting him, she'd made him an offer he couldn't refuse. He would help her with her property adjustments, and she would make his permit problem disappear. Just as I finished reading, I spotted Derek walking his dog across the street. He wouldn't meet my eyes, but I noticed something I'd never seen before. A thick folder tucked under his arm with the HOA logo. I decided to follow him, keeping my distance behind the row of maple trees lining our street. Derek didn't go to the dog park like usual. Instead, he headed straight to Margaret's house, letting himself in through the side gate. I crept closer to the fence, my phone ready to record. Through the gap in the boards, I could see them spreading papers across her patio table. Margaret was pointing at different areas on a map, while Derek nodded and made marks with a red pen. Suddenly, my view was blocked by Margaret's daughter, Emma, who'd caught me peeking. But instead of raising the alarm, she motioned me to meet her around the corner. Emma looked nervous as she whispered, "Mom's been doing this for years. She has a whole filing cabinet of altered property documents in her home office. She made me help organize them last month." My mind was racing. This wasn't just about my boat anymore. This was organized fraud. Emma explained that her mom had been slowly redrawing property lines throughout the neighborhood, creating new common areas that gave the HOA, meaning Margaret, more control. She'd even set up fake email accounts to send official-looking notifications about property line updates. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Linda Chen, who lived across the street. She'd been helping me research property laws and had made a shocking discovery at the county office. Some of Margaret's doctored documents had actually been filed there, but the clerk had flagged them for inconsistencies. Linda had the clerk's contact information and suggested we set up a meeting. As I walked home, Derek's dog started barking frantically. Margaret came rushing out, and I quickly ducked behind Mrs. Patterson's large hydrangea bushes. Through the leaves, I watched Margaret hand Derek another envelope. His hands were shaking as he stuffed it in his pocket. That evening, I found another note from Derek in my mailbox. This one had copies of emails between him and Margaret, showing how she'd threatened other neighbors too. But the real bombshell was a USB drive, containing scans of the original neighborhood, plans from 1995, before Margaret started making her adjustments. I was about to call Linda with this new evidence when I noticed a moving truck backing into Derek's driveway. He was loading boxes in the dark, his wife crying softly as she carried out their family photos. They were running away instead of facing what they'd done. I stood there watching them pack, torn between anger at their cowardice and understanding their fear. Margaret had built herself a house of cards, using everyone's secrets to keep them in line. But she didn't know about Emma's confession, Linda's discovery at the county office, or the USB drive now hidden safely in my desk. As Derek's truck pulled away, Margaret appeared on her front porch, watching them leave with a satisfied smile. She turned and saw me standing there, and for just a second her smile wavered. She had no idea that her perfectly constructed scheme was about to come crashing down. But I had to be smart about this. One wrong move and those documents might mysteriously disappear. I walked back inside, ignoring Margaret's overly sweet "good evening." Behind my closed door, I started making copies of everything. Derek's letters, Emma's text messages, the USB contents. Tomorrow would change everything, but tonight, I needed to make sure all my evidence was safe. Because if there's one thing I'd learned, it was that Margaret wouldn't go down without a fight. The sound of metal chains dragging across concrete jolted me awake. My bedside clock blinked 5:03 a.m., and through my bedroom window, I could see flashing yellow lights casting eerie shadows on my front lawn. My heart stopped when I realized what was happening. They were taking my boat. I threw on my shoes and grabbed my phone, already recording as I rushed outside into the chilly morning air. There was Margaret, standing in her perfectly pressed pantsuit, directing a very uncomfortable-looking tow truck driver like she was conducting an orchestra. Two other HOA board members, Pete and Susan, stood behind her like bodyguards, trying to look tough in their matching HOA polos. "What do you think you're doing?" I called out, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking with anger. Margaret's head snapped toward me, and for a split second, I saw surprise flash across her face before that familiar smirk returned. "Enforcing HOA regulations," she said, waving a paper at me. "We warned you about this eyesore. Now we're taking action." The tow truck driver paused, his hands hovering over the controls as he looked between us nervously. I pulled out my property survey on my phone, the one I'd carefully saved after Derek's warning. "This is private property, and you know it. You have no right to be here." The driver's face changed when he heard those words, but Margaret quickly shoved her paper in his face. "We have documentation right here, showing this is common area property," she declared, but I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she held the paper. "Continue with the removal, please." That's when I spotted something odd. The HOA letterhead on her document looked different from the usual ones. The font was slightly off, and the logo wasn't quite right. I zoomed in with my phone camera, making sure to get a clear shot of what I suspected was another forged document. The driver looked increasingly unsure. "Ma'am, if this is a property dispute, I can't take the boat. It's a liability issue." Margaret's face turned red, and she pulled out her phone, threatening to call his supervisor. I stayed calm and dialed the police non-emergency line, putting it on speaker. Margaret's eyes widened as I clearly explained the situation. HOA, members trespassing on private property, attempting unauthorized removal of my boat. The dispatcher assured me officers were on their way. But Margaret wasn't backing down. She whispered something to Pete, who ran to his car and returned with more papers. They huddled together, swapping documents around like kids trading baseball cards, clearly not expecting me to be awake and fighting back. Then something unexpected happened. Susan, who'd been quiet this whole time, suddenly stepped forward. "Margaret, maybe we should wait. If he has survey documents..." Margaret whirled around, shooting Susan a look that could freeze lava. Susan shrank back, but I'd caught it all on video, the first crack in Margaret's perfect facade. The tow truck driver had seen enough. "Look, I'm not getting mixed up in this. Call us back when you've got this sorted out legally." He started packing up his equipment, ignoring Margaret's protests and threats to call his company. As red and blue lights appeared at the end of the street, I noticed Derek watching from his window. Our eyes met, and he quickly closed his curtains, but not before I saw him holding up his phone, and I realized he'd been recording too. The police arrived just as Margaret and her team were trying to leave. The officers took statements from everyone, and I made sure to show them my property survey and the video of the whole incident. One officer looked particularly interested in Margaret's documents, taking photos and making notes. What Margaret didn't know was that while she was busy arguing with the police, I was texting Linda Chen. As a retired property lawyer, Linda had seen plenty of HOA overreach in her time, but even she was shocked by the photos I sent her of Margaret's suspicious documents. As the sun rose over our neighborhood, Margaret and her crew finally left, but not before she turned and said something that sent chills down my spine. "This isn't over. You have no idea what you're dealing with." She was right about one thing: it wasn't over. Because while she was focused on towing my boat, she didn't notice the security cameras I'd installed after Derek's warning, catching every moment of her early morning raid from multiple angles. And those cameras caught something else too. Something that would turn this whole case upside down. I just had to wait for Linda to confirm what I thought I was seeing in those documents. I couldn't sleep after my boat was towed, so I decided to do some digging. Linda Chen, my neighbor who used to be a property lawyer, invited me over for coffee the next morning. When I showed her my old property maps, she nearly spilled her drink. The boundaries were completely different from what Margaret had been showing everyone. Linda pulled out her laptop and logged into the county records website. We spent hours comparing documents, and what we found made my heart race. Every single property line change in our neighborhood over the past year had Margaret's fingerprints all over them. She'd been slowly nibbling away at people's land, turning private property into common areas that the HOA could control. But we hit the jackpot when Linda noticed something odd about the filing dates. Margaret had tried to backdate her changes, but she'd messed up. Some of her documents were dated on weekends when the county office was closed. Even better, the clerk who supposedly signed them had retired 2 years before the date on the papers. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek's wife, Amy. She was crying, saying Derek hadn't slept in days because of guilt. She sent me photos of meetings where Margaret had pressured Derek to help her create fake documents. Margaret had promised to ignore his illegal pool house, but now she was threatening to report it anyway. Things got even more interesting when Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street stopped by. She'd overheard Margaret on the phone with someone from another HOA, teaching them how to adjust property lines to create more common areas. Mrs. Rodriguez had recorded the whole conversation on her phone because she thought it sounded fishy. Linda and I drove to the county clerk's office to dig deeper. The clerk, Mr. Johnson, remembered Margaret because she'd thrown a fit when he questioned some of her paperwork. He pulled out files showing she'd tried to register changes to almost every property in our neighborhood. Some changes were small, just a few feet here and there, but they always gave the HOA more control. We found security camera footage from the clerk's office showing Margaret arguing with staff when they wouldn't accept her documents. In one video, she accidentally dropped a folder, spilling papers everywhere. The cameras caught glimpses of rubber, stamps, and official-looking seals that definitely weren't supposed to be in her possession. Back at home, I started getting calls from other neighborhoods. Word had spread about our investigation, and people wanted to share similar stories. Margaret had apparently been consulting for other HOAs, teaching them her tricks. One community had lost their entire playground because their HOA claimed the land using Margaret's methods. My security cameras caught Margaret and Derek in my yard that night, measuring and taking photos. They didn't notice the new cameras I'd installed after the boat incident. When they started arguing about property lines, every word was recorded crystal clear. Margaret was yelling at Derek for leaving a paper trail, while he kept saying they needed to come clean. Linda helped me organize all our evidence into a clear case. We had property records spanning 20 years, showing how the land had really been divided. We found Margaret's fake documents, complete with forged signatures and impossible dates. We had video evidence, witness statements, and even Derek's confession. The next day, I spotted Margaret at the county office again, trying to file more paperwork. But this time, Mr. Johnson gave me a subtle wink as he made copies of everything she submitted. He'd been helping us build our case, carefully documenting every false document she tried to sneak through. Just when we thought we had enough evidence, my old friend Mike from the title company called. He'd found something even bigger in Margaret's past. She'd pulled the same scheme in 3 other communities before moving here, but she'd always moved on before people caught on. This time would be different. That evening, as I watched Margaret strut around the neighborhood with her clipboard, writing up fake violations, I felt strangely calm. Tomorrow's emergency board meeting would change everything. She had no idea that every piece of her puzzle was about to fall apart. Linda sat beside me, reviewing our presentation one last time, when we noticed something that made us both freeze. Margaret wasn't just stealing land, she was selling parts of it too. The emergency HOA meeting started with a bang when I wheeled in a projector and several boxes of documents. Margaret sat in her usual spot at the head table, wearing her fake pearls and an even faker smile. She had no idea what was coming. I started my presentation with a simple question to the packed room. How many of you have received violation notices about your property lines in the last 6 months? Almost every hand went up. Margaret's smile twitched as I pulled up the first slide showing her forged property map next to the official county records. The room went dead silent when Linda Chen, our retired property lawyer, walked in wearing her court suit. She'd helped me prepare a detailed presentation, showing how Margaret had been slowly moving property lines throughout our neighborhood. Each slide showed another piece of land Margaret had tried to claim as common area, including my boat parking spot. That's when Derek, shaking like a leaf, stood up to speak. He confessed everything, how Margaret had pressured him to help create fake documents by threatening to expose his pool house violation, but he'd kept copies of every document they'd worked on, including emails where Margaret laid out her whole scheme. The shock in the room turned to anger when I showed the financial records Linda had helped me uncover. Margaret hadn't just been stealing land, she'd been charging storage fees for vehicles parked on what she claimed was HOA property, pocketing thousands of dollars. The money trail led straight to a private account in her name. Just as Margaret started sputtering excuses about community beautification, I played my trump card: security, camera footage from my house and 3 neighbors, showing the exact moment she directed the tow truck to take my boat. The driver's uncertain face and Margaret's aggressive gesturing told the whole story. But the real bombshell came when Mrs. Rodriguez, from the county clerk's office, stepped forward. She described how Margaret had tried to bully her into filing the doctored property documents, even attempting to bribe her. Mrs. Rodriguez had documented everything, including photos of the forged papers Margaret had submitted. Margaret finally lost it. She jumped up, screaming that we were all ungrateful, and that she was the only one who cared about property values. Her meltdown was interrupted by 2 police officers. Walking in, they'd been waiting outside. After reviewing our evidence earlier that day, the vote to remove Margaret was unanimous, as she was escorted out. Still yelling about her vision for the community, I noticed Derek crying with relief in his seat. The weight of his guilt had been crushing him, and now he could finally breathe. We spent the next 3 hours electing a new board and starting the process of correcting all the property records Margaret had tried to alter. Linda Chen became our new president, promising transparency and proper legal procedures for everything. The next morning, I got my boat back. The towing company apologized and refunded all fees after seeing the real property documents. They even offered to testify against Margaret if needed. A week later, Margaret's house went up for sale. While helping the real estate agent measure the property lines correctly, we discovered something interesting. Margaret's own backyard was smaller than she'd claimed. She'd been living on her neighbor's land for years, thanks to her own fake property maps. The story made the local news, leading other HOA communities to start checking their own property records. 3 other HOA presidents in nearby neighborhoods suddenly resigned. Linda got calls from lawyers representing homeowners in similar situations, all asking for advice. Yesterday, I saw Margaret looking at houses in a nearby gated community. She was carrying a folder labeled Community Improvement Plans. I thought about warning them, but then had a better idea. I called Linda, and we decided to start a website tracking HOA fraud cases. We'd help other homeowners spot the warning signs and fight back with facts and documentation. As I parked my boat in its rightful spot this morning, I noticed Derek installing security cameras on his house. He waved and smiled, a real smile this time. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air, and our neighborhood was finally breathing freely again. But this morning I got an interesting email from a homeowner in that gated community Margaret was eyeing. They wanted to know more about our experience. I looked at my boxes of evidence and smiled. Maybe it was time to pay it forward and help another community avoid what we'd been through.